Welcome to yet another in the series of Perth USAsia Centre Foreign Policy Conversations, this one being conducted virtually between here in Perth and Melbourne. And it's one that really should be, by all accounts, in person. Our guest today is someone known extremely well here in Perth, a member of the Perth USAsia Centre Board of Directors, Deirdre Willmott. Deirdre, thank you so much for taking time to join us today. Really appreciate it.
Hi, Gordon. Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure.
Well, Deirdre is in Melbourne. Unfortunately, we can't entice her to come back home here to WA, but she is extremely well known to our community here. Her long public service here, her time as CEO of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and now currently serving as a member of the board of Australia Post, among many other roles, which I will tease out during the course of our conversation. But let me just note, Deirdre, that this decision to do this interview really came out of a conversation you and I had a couple of weeks ago after we launched our hydrogen report. We were talking about, the underlying requirements of building an export infrastructure for these new technologies, hydrogen, critical materials, lithium, et cetera. And then it occurred to me, at least in particular, and I think you probably got there long before I did, that you were literally in the room where it happened during previous stages of WA's development. So for those of you who don't know, Deirdre served as chief of staff to not just one, but two WA premiers, Richard Court and then later on Colin Barnett, during a really important time in our state development. And we just realized that we had one of the greatest experts already on our board. So we should have this conversation. So Deirdre, thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Yes, and it was really listening to the launch of James Bowen's excellent paper on the hydrogen industry that made me realise the history and think about the history that Western Australia has. And the fact that I had been privileged enough to see two premiers in their role building that history. And a big part of our relationship with our Asian trading partners is the history that we have. I grew up in Western Australia, and some of my earliest memories of current affairs were Sir Charles Court as Minister for Development and subsequently Premier, coming on the news and just telling us what a bright future we had, what tremendous opportunities we had in Western Australia to grow the iron ore industry and then later the LNG industry. And he was just always so excited and so energised. And I think that really flowed through to our belief in who we were. And when you look back over his biography, the personal drive that he brought to growing those industries and subsequent premiers have absolutely followed in his footsteps of being really hands-on. These are relationships that the industry are central in, but Western Australia has really grown and developed those relationships, has guided how our industries have developed, and it's been very much the energy and the enthusiasm of premiers and their ministers.
Well, it's often said that those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. That's often said in a negative vein, but the flip side is probably also true, right? If you don't understand your history, you may not be able to replicate it, right? You're trying to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. And so we're in a situation we need to understand what happened in the past to have a good idea as to where we need to go in the future. So I'd really like to get a little bit more into your insights, particularly on having been there through almost a full spectrum of our involvement. Iron ore may have been both before my time and before your time, but for the LNG industry, which is, again, our second largest exporter as a country right now, it does seem to me that you were there for the full, development phase of that industry and our relationships in Northeast Asia. I would certainly welcome your insights and your recollections as to that process.
Well, of course, our natural gas industry started with the Northwest Shelf. And again, that was Sir Charles who worked on getting Woodside and their joint venture partners to develop that project. Really central to that project was the offtake agreement by the SEC, the forerunner of Synergy, supported by the state government. Very controversial at the time, but it enabled that industry to get started with that local demand and then build up into exports. When I was Richard Court's chief of staff, his vision was to open China as a market to Western Australian LNG. And he personally travelled to China, he worked with industry, he understood exactly what it would take to open up China, because he saw the potential of China as a market and believed that if we wanted to grow, we needed to be attached to that growth story. So that was very much a premier who had a vision and drove it. And one of the things about really doing something new and different is you have to be passionate about it. You have to work on it every day. And people around you may well get sick of hearing about it. But until somebody is invested to that level, other jobs I've worked in over the years, I've seen that passion, and that's what it takes for a leader to really make change. And reading back over Sir Charles's biography, that is absolutely what he brought to iron ore and to LNG, was jumping on planes and going and talking to financiers, going over to Asia, understanding our markets and how we needed to get into those markets, as well as what industry actually needed to do to make those markets happen. And of course, in those days, Western Australia didn't have any money. So not only was he getting them to come and open iron ore mines, he was getting them to come and build towns and ports and all the infrastructure that went with it. So it really was quite remarkable. And sitting in meetings with the representatives of the Japanese government and of the major trading houses and companies to whom we sold our iron ore with Richard Court, what always came through in those meetings was that the importance of that history, the successes once they were realised, but the personal relationships that had developed. And there was just such an admiration for Sir Charles. And Richard developed those relationships, and Colin Barnett continued those, as have other premiers. But certainly, to me, that personal connection and those personal relationships have been really important. But the other thing that's important about history, and it came through in those meetings as well, is understanding what we didn't necessarily get right along the way, because that's part of the memory that our partners have of us. When I was Richard Court's Chief of Staff, the first question with those in those meetings was always, what's happening in industrial relations? Because our trading partners felt that they had been burnt by the industrial relations situation of the 70s and 80s, when we saw a lot of strikes, a lot of delays in shipping, a lot of delays in construction. So we were seen as a jurisdiction where industrial relations was an issue. Now, by the time I was Richard Court's Chief of Staff, industrial relations had settled down a lot, but it was still the number one question. Nearly 10 years later, when I was Colin Barnett's Chief of Staff, I'd sit in meetings with representatives of the same companies. It wasn't the first question, but it was about the third question. It was still on the list, years after we thought that was something that we had solved. So understanding that history, understanding how other people see us in the context of that history is really important.
I think most of our viewers will know that former Premier Richard Court went on to be ambassador to Japan for Australia, and those relationships that you so well described certainly served him well in that context. Look, I jokingly earlier used the term "in the room where it happened," which is a line from the Hamilton musical. For those who haven't seen it, it hasn't come here to Perth yet. I don't know if it's yet made it to Melbourne, but I think you have a better chance of seeing it than I do.
We're pandemic delayed. We were supposed to see it in September, but we are now booked in March.
But the reference is obviously, to having someone that was inside, the corridors of decision making when these things happen. And again, you've been there for government, but you've also had some very significant private sector roles. So you've kind of seen it for both sides. I wonder if I might get you to reflect a little bit on the development of these major export industries, these sectors, the role of government versus the role of private sector? Because obviously, both have unique roles, and I'm curious as to your conclusions on that.
So, as I referred to briefly before, it's all been done by industry, in that industry has had to actually raise the money and put in place the offtake agreements and the sale and purchase agreements with our customers, but very much alongside government. I think I heard Colin Barnett say a number of times in meetings that in these resources contracts, there were very much three parties. There was the operator of the project here, there was the purchaser overseas, and there was the state government, which owned the resources. And I think everybody along the way has respected that. The state government early on introduced state agreements, so we really had a very particular way of dealing with the state, managing all of our approvals. It was all ratified by Parliament. So that was a really good way of giving confidence to proponents and projects, as well as our trading partners. And I think as we've gone on, obviously more players have come into the industries and have developed new projects. But I think everybody has had the benefit of a state where we have public officials, elected representatives, and professional services firms and suppliers who all understand the industry and have grown up against that background. And I think the Department of Jobs and Tourism and Industry and their forerunners are just an amazing resource for industry and for people wanting to work in these areas. And it's easy to take it for granted when you've grown up with it, but it really is. It really has been very beneficial to many people who've done very well over the years.
No, thank you. And again, I appreciate the balance of your perspective, because often that's missing in the public discourse. It tends to be all private or all government, and not realizing how deep and longstanding those partnerships are. And obviously, there's lessons there too for where we need to go in the future in terms of what worked well in the past. And I think what you have described is the framework that's created the foundation upon which we are today, right? Which is a helpful thing. It didn't always exist that way, right? Had to be built. Let me ask you to reflect a little more broadly on the region. You've kindly served now for a long time on the board of directors of the Perth USAsia Centre from our very inception. And you will know that one of our kind of organizational mantras has been diversify, diversify, diversify. And we're really interested in the broader Indo-Pacific, making sure that Australia as a country, Western Australia specifically as a state, it diversifies not only its trading relationships and its markets, but also the core products or exports that it's exporting. I wonder if you kind of give us your view of the Indo-Pacific, your view of the region. I know that I had a chance to be in Tokyo with you when you were there on wearing your Australia Post hat. Remarkably deep ties in Japan, but there's also Indonesia, there's India. I'm curious as to your take on the Indo-Pacific.
Well, I guess, again, looking back at what I've seen in the past, I was fortunate enough to travel to Japan and on a separate visit to China as Chief of Staff to Premier Colin Barnett. And I would say that the West Australian trade representatives are incredibly important for the state and for businesses wanting to work in those markets. The people who were there at that time just had a huge depth of knowledge about our industries, about who we might be able to work with, and who the people in those companies and businesses in those countries were. So I think for anybody wanting to work in any of those countries, the Western Australian trade representative is a very, very important place to start. JATSI itself is also a really important reserve of information about how to go into markets and who else might already be in those markets. And then, of course, the work that we do at the centre and the Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the bilateral chambers. There are really great networks in Western Australia of people who are already working in those markets. Before you even leave home, you can start finding out a lot about what's happening in those markets and where to go. I also think that the growing world of e-commerce now, at the moment, we're very constrained with supply chains and what can move around, but this pandemic will pass, I'm sure. And but what won't change is the amount of work, the amount of trade that is now happening through e-commerce. And Australia Post is growing its global e-commerce business quite considerably, and now looking at things like platforms where you can put your produce online and the platform operator will organise the in-market marketing for you, so they'll know about local communications channels, local ways of communicating, local language. They can do all that for you, and they can also manage all that cross-border customs interaction for you. So I think anybody looking at going into new markets, there's now lots of different ways of reaching those markets that over time will get easier and easier to manage. The other, from my time at the Chamber, the people who are going into a lot of these new markets are people in Australia from those countries who have family and networks in those countries, so they know where to start, and the experience of many too is that we should start in an area. You can't sort of say, I'm going to sell my products in India, because it's so many markets. And actually, one thing I did want to say is that in Japan and China, the sister state relationships are very long-standing and, again, underpin real relationships between people in those countries and in our state. So I think looking at those provinces first, given the depth of relationships that we have, is a very good place to start. And we're now looking at expanding the sister state relationships in Vietnam, I believe, in China, in India. And I think that's an excellent basis on which to diversify our export opportunities and relationships into those countries.
Well, you've actually given us three really insightful points. And again, from your own experience background, one, e-commerce. I think there's a lot of people in Australia and worldwide who thinks that international trade requires some Herculean task to get on boats and go to new countries and hack your way through jungles to find new markets. When the reality is, as you point out, in this interconnected world, maybe even more so after COVID, there are people whose very job it is to provide platforms and connectivity. So that's a really useful insight in terms of the process. Secondly, your focus on the diaspora, the fact that we have such a tremendous Asian Australian community that already have relationships and family ties and expertise that are criminally underutilized. I would note that we're working on that here in WA, but where you are in Melbourne, I think there's getting close to 700,000 Indian Australians in Victoria alone. And that kind of explains why Victoria has had such a tremendously successful India engagement strategy, country specific, built on the backbone of their own population. And then finally, your note about building on existing relationships, sister states, et cetera, I found insightful. Just let me slip in an institutional advertisement here. You'll see that we have next week, and I know when this video will come out, but it will likely have been launched before you've seen this. We've got a a sister state relationship with Bà Địa Vũng Tàu province in Vietnam, and we're launching a new report on that, including a speech by the Vietnamese ambassador in Canberra. And we've got an ongoing series on India beyond Delhi, including one actually focusing next, I think, on video gaming and the gaming industry, which I obviously have a lot to learn about. So anyway, thank you for that. It gave me a perfect platform for me to jump in there. Let me turn back, if I might, to another recent center program, which you're aware of, and I think you've read the report. You know that we've done reports and some deep dive research on critical materials, rare earths in particular, on future batteries, on lithium, on secure supply chains. And our most recent report in that vein has been on hydrogen. And we had a wonderful launch event a couple of weeks ago, which you kindly joined us for virtually. I wondered if you might just talk about, the energy transition that Australia is going through, and I welcome your own reactions to our hydrogen report and the program we did. What did we get right? What are we missing? What should we focus on?
Yeah, well, James Bowen's report is excellent, and I think it's very, very timely. The whole world is focusing on decarbonisation, and the point was made during the launch and in James's report that it's that focus on decarbonisation that is actually driving interest in and opportunities for hydrogen as a new source of transferring energy, particularly green hydrogen, but the other colours of hydrogen as well through the network to those who want to be able to carry on their energy-intensive processes in an emissions-free way. So incredibly important. And one of the things about WA industry is that we've been incredibly successful at exporting. All our state agreements actually included a requirement for downstream processing. And I guess you would have to say that the dream of using our abundant energy supplies for manufacturing and downstream processing in Western Australia has not been as successful. Maybe hydrogen will change that, but I think we've got to look at a way of making sure that our abundant supply of sunshine and wind can transfer into, can be translated into very cost-effective product. So our renewable electricity and hydrogen needs to be very cost effective. So we have to look at the cost of development and the cost of going from concept to actually delivering a project. I think that the way hydrogen seems to be rolling out at the moment is there's very much a focus on decarbonising existing operations. So we are seeing investment, I think, in renewable energy and potentially moving into hydrogen by people who are operating in energy-intensive industries here in Australia already. So maybe with that will come the opportunity to actually be doing more energy-intensive industry in Australia, or certainly the prospect of then growing that hydrogen capacity and exporting hydrogen from that capacity. But I think before we start thinking big project in the Pilbara exporting, we need to perhaps look at how do we decarbonise our own industries and develop that technology, bring down that price of production and transport. In terms of potential export industries, the Premier's announced that he's going to visit Japan, Korea and China next year. I think that's incredibly important. Ambassador James Choi said last week that people in Korea were already asking him, how can we buy hydrogen? I think if there's an opportunity for the Premier to go to Korea and find out more about who wants to buy that hydrogen, and how do we make sure that they want to buy hydrogen from us. And Dr. Tanaka spoke last week too about a demand-driven industry, that these countries know they're going to need hydrogen. But he also spoke too about the infrastructure for growing that industry, and incredibly important that we understand how those countries are developing their infrastructure. He talked about different jurisdictions that are getting ready to export or already exporting. He talked about pipelines. He talked about receival terminals. What will they build, or what do they need to build in order for us to be able to export? And is that part of their plan? I think they're all things that we really need to keep a close eye on. I certainly remember before we could sell LNG into China, they had to have a receival terminal. So it all hung on an investment in a receival terminal in Guangdong province. From Western Australia, we kept a very close eye on what their investment plans were for that infrastructure.
Well, Australians are very familiar with the term the tyranny of distance. Some have turned that on its head in the security sense and said tyranny of proximity. But for me, there's another issue that I'd like you to address, and that's what I might call the tyranny of demography, right? Our country as a whole still has 25 million people, just a few more than Taiwan, despite the breadth. And just barely over 10% of that is resident in Western Australia, full third of the continent of the country. And so while I actually really appreciate your comments about needing to build capacity in terms of our own application of hydrogen or other less carbon intensive technologies in WA, which then in turn might help us do downstream processing here and rebuild an industrial base here too. We still do have this question of people in terms of that process, which is why I want to, and it's probably never wise to disagree with a member of your board, but I want to push back a little bit on you in terms of the sequencing of things. And I don't know that it necessarily has to be A, B, or either or, but it does strike me that the scale of investment that you saw in the LNG era that was geared towards export. So we do have a reserve gas pipeline that serves us here, but that's a small percentage of the overall LNG output. Similarly, we don't use any of our iron ore domestically here. It all goes externally. And our kind of conclusion is, at least my own personal opinion, is that the real large-scale investment that's going to be necessary to build what you were just describing as your experience from LNG, offtake terminals, the infrastructure necessary to export, is only going to be possible if you've got a major international export market built to Japan, Korea, China, or elsewhere for that hydrogen coming up there that will then in turn drive our industry here. So again, it's a bit of a sequencing question. And as you can tell, I don't have clear answers, but I just wanted to get more of your insight on the process there.
Look, Gordon, I certainly don't have the answers, but having lived through the build-up of those previous industries, I think it's incredibly important, and I think the West Australian government is best placed to really get its finger on the button of those issues. So, as our traditional export partners plan their infrastructure, plan their future demands, are we part of that? Because unless we have a market and the investors and the project operators, it's not going to happen. But which comes first is always going to be the question. But I think the Premier and the ministers are absolutely best placed to keep well abreast of where industry are, what industry's capability is, the conversations that they're having, what their costs are looking like. Will we actually have a competitive product to put into the market, and then understanding what our export, our traditional export markets, where their planning's at, and make sure that they're aware of what we think we can do so that their planning includes us.
Well, thank you. That's insight born of experience. I appreciate that very much. Let me wrap up with one final question. And again, juxtapositioning your current role with your previous roles. Much of Australia's and WA's in particular's export success in the past has been on these large scale backbones of the resource industry. Initially agriculture, but after that, iron ore or LNG, and now we're looking at some logical as well. But in many of the countries in the region, it's not going to be a single silver bullet. It's going to be a lot of different things. You've already referred to AusPost, but I wonder if you would just kind of give your broader views on Asian engagement, engaging the Indo-Pacific era. Let me reframe it a little bit. As we now come out of the pandemic and we start thinking about what are the next phases for the state economy, for the national economy, for Australia to engage economically in this region, what advice would you be giving us? What should we be focusing on?
Again, based on what we've been able to do in the past, I think we just need to get back out there. We just need to be having the conversations, understanding our neighbours, understanding where they see their futures coming out of this pandemic, talking to them about how we can help them. I think all relationships are built on, how mutual respect and mutual benefit. How can we be, how can we help them and be part of their future? But first and foremost, I think we need to get back out there. We need to be, reopening our doors to our international students and being part of the future of young people from our neighbouring countries. All of that's really important, but I think we just have to absolutely throw ourselves into it with a passion because we are small. We are a long way from those other countries. Europe is very active. The United States, there are people there who just want to get back to business. I think that the whole world is wanting to just get back out and do what they love doing. And I think for them to do it with us, we need to be there.
Boy, I couldn't have wrapped up this conversation better. The notion that we've just got to get back out there. And as you added, get them back here, right? I mean, there's really no substitute for that personal to person contact. And that obviously includes you. It's been far too long since our state borders have been thrown up, so you can't come home from Melbourne in that regard. But we look forward to seeing you again in person. Until then, we appreciate your strong connectivity with the Centre and with WA and your leadership on these issues virtually and remotely, electronically, at whatever format we must take. So Deirdre, thank you so much for your time and your insights today.
Thank you so much, Gordon.